One significant element of this is that this is the one group that had previously acted as the closest thing to an ideological backbone in the Democratic Party was the labor union movement, which had allied with FDR and held broadly held itself as the tentpole of the Democratic coalition, even with all of the reactionary Southerners, all through the 50s and 60s, into the 70s. The breaking of labor power after the crisis of the 70s meant that liberalism lost a economic raison d'etre. It became more cultural. And so you had sort of a cultural liberalism with a vague commitment to egalitarianism versus a Republican Party that was wholly committed to social and economic reaction. And the first person to really understand the implications of this was Mitch motherfucking McConnell. In his own way, he really is a genius, a dark, monstrous genius. Because while every other Republican saw the ass kicking that they took in 2008, where they were routed at every level of government in a repudiation of the disastrous Bush administration, which had seen the horrifying war in Iraq and an economic collapse, the destruction of a major American city, most Republicans were ready to do what was generally the thing that the party out of power did when a new party came in. Reach across the aisle. Try to get some of that goodwill rubbed on them so that they weren't blamed. Make some deals. But McConnell realized something. McConnell realized that in an era of ideologically coherent parties, there is no benefit to compromising with the other side. There is no rational reason to give the party in power, by power I mean in the top office, being the party in power, the presidential party, giving the president a win on anything. There is no benefit to doing that. And because people will associate any success with him and his party. And any seats his party wins are seats that your party loses. So to the degree to which he is able to advance his popularity and his agenda and gain seats is the degree to which your party loses seats, loses the ability to influence policy. Their agenda is defeated. So there's no point to ever helping the party in power get any sort of policy through. The fear for many years was, if you look intransigent, the people are going to punish you. But what McConnell realized is that people don't pay that close attention, at least not enough of them do. If the president flounders, if the president fails to enact his agenda, people will blame him for it, especially if the economy is struggling. And they will do the only thing they can, which is reward the party out of power, even if they were the ones who made him not able to carry out his agenda, because there's nowhere else for them to do. There's nothing else for them to do. They can stay home, but that doesn't affect the final vote. Or they can do what most people who aren't ideologically committed, that narrow segment in the middle that often decides a lot of these cases, a lot of these races, they can vote. They can punish the president. They can punish the party in power by voting for the opposition. And that's you. If you're Mitch McConnell in 2008, that's you. And it fucking worked. 2010, the Republicans, after being a bunch of intransigent shitheads who actively worked to make the recession worse, who actively worked to make the healthcare reform that was passed worse, were rewarded with a huge swing in the House and recaptured the House. Now, the thing about it is that this was always the case. This flaw was built into the system because of the amount, the number of veto points that are set up inside the legislative system and the separation of powers between a president and Congress. A party that is unified and opposed to another party and holds positions of veto within these structures can absolutely prevent anything from passing, can grind everything to a halt, even in the face of significant crises that need legislative action immediately. They can just say no, and they can be confident that intransigence will be rewarded in the long term by people punishing the party that can't get things done by voting for them. This flaw within the system, this fundamental bug in the code of the Constitution, it was disguised for almost 200 years by the vagaries of geography and by happenstance of history, by the fact that regional distinctions ended up becoming more salient to the creation of political coalitions than ideological ones did. But that time is over. The 60s ended it. We now have largely coherent, ideologically consistent parties. There's a range within them, but there's a left and a right party, broadly construed. Obviously, this is within the very narrow bands of American electoral politics, but it's enough that parties in power understand, or at least the Republicans do, that reaching across the aisle, being bipartisan, making a deal is not in your interest. It is, in fact, irrational to do that. The rational thing to do is to refuse any and all compromise, wait for the whole thing to shudder to a halt, wait for the party in power to fail miserably, and then reap the victory in the form of protest votes for you. And then when you're in power, you can do what they've been doing ever since 2016, which is destroy all of the precious checks and balances between the branches that were lovingly crafted by the founders. Oh, the president's not going to be able to become a dictator. He's not going to be able to just do flagrant illegalities. Why? Congress will stop them. Why would Congress stop them? Oh, because Congress will see themselves first and foremost as representatives of that body, not as representatives of a party. Well, what if they see themselves first and foremost as members of a party and not members of Congress? Oh, shit, yeah, no, then it all goes to hell. Then the president gets to do whatever he wants. And that's where we are. We are now at the end of the road here, where ideologically coherent political parties can short-circuit the checks and balances that prevented overreach of power and corruption, and also have made reform literally impossible, have made it so that no compromise can be reached. So what can we learn from this? The thing we need to remember, listening to people fret during this election campaign about the need to be able to reach across the aisle, the need to be able to get things done in some abstract system, is impossible. It's gibberish. It is not. It doesn't relate to the actual functionality of the system we're talking about. This system can't work. The kind of reforms that are necessary to avoid environmental and social catastrophe in not even the long term, in the fucking medium to near term, are impossible. They cannot be obtained within this system. It was designed specifically to prevent these things from happening. It was designed to be a playground for the upper class to negotiate between themselves. The introduction of mass party democracy and ideologically coherent political parties has upended that and essentially switched a master flip, a fail-safe within the constitutional system to prevent the great beast from holding any power. And so all this talk about getting things done, about reaching across the aisle, about how important it is to have well-developed wonk policies, it's all irrelevant to the incentive structure of parties in power, especially when you consider the decades-long Republican effort to entrench their disproportionate minority power through gerrymandering in the courts. What this means is that any electoral strategy to overcome the system will have to be premised on a completely new strategy. It cannot be premised on piecemeal reform and reaching across the aisle and making deals. Deals are not to be had. The system must be overwhelmed by an unprecedented level of voter citizen engagement, which will then be coordinated, ideally, with a rise in labor militancy that can pressure government from the outside and shut down, if needs be, key sectors of the economy. And that is why it's important to remember, and if Bernie wins, which I am rooting for, obviously, I hope many of you are, if Bernie wins, it's got to be remembered. He will likely, in his time in office, not get much accomplished. He's not going to get Medicare for all, most likely. He's not going to get the student debt jubilee that we're talking about. He's not going to get the things that he's been envisioning. But every fucking wonk piece of shit who's pumping up one of these other gargoyles needs to shut the fuck up, because none of the rest of them will accomplishing anything either. Not with a disproportionately Republican Senate that, even if they're not in the majority, have levers of power within that body to prevent reform being there. They're not going to do it. The system has reached a point of critical failure. No Democratic president in office in the current parameters will achieve jack shit. But of those failures, which are all inevitable, as I said, only Bernie's failure has the potential to allow for the revitalization of a labor movement and a widespread disenchantment with the Democratic Party that could potentially lead to the sort of unprecedented, really, mobilization that will be necessary to successfully confront capital and successfully confront these sclerotic political structures that must be abolished. Change that is meaningful, change that can save us from the worst outcomes, is impossible in the current system. The current system must be abolished. So the only question for anybody who is still invested in any way in electoral politics is, what is the way forward that could bring about that final confrontation between an engaged and mobilized citizenry, ideally mobilizing around workplaces with vital functions to the economy, and this sclerotic talking house for plutocrats and their disgusting minions. All right, guys, that's been another inebriated cast. No, that's been another inebriated past with Matt.